The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Chapter 16. David, Egypt, and the Census. In the Old Testament, David, the lover or beloved, as we may render his name, is the counterpart of the Semitic and classical Adonis, first among the fertility hero gods of the ancient world. The name Adonis is related to the Semitic common noun Adon, Lord. The root meaning of both we may now trace to the same Sumerian Andul, heavenly shade, as gave the name Atlas to the mighty man of mythology who holds aloft the canopy of heaven. The basic conception is one of protection and thus lordship, in that sense of shielding the land and people from outward harm. The same picture is presented in another of the god's names, Na-Amon, traceable now to a Sumerian Na-Flaba'an, stretched across the sky. Thus, within the mushroom cult, both names, Adonis and Na-Iman, can have a specific reference to the canopy of the fungus, viewed in the kind cosmographical terms we have just discussed. Later, we shall look again at the Adonis, Na-Iman figure and its particular application to the cultivation and use of the sacred fungus. For the moment, we may study more particularly his Old Testament representative, David, whose Adonis and fertility connections are plainly set out in the oracle ascribed to his authorship. The oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the erect phallus, the man who was raised on high, the semen-smeared, anointed, of the God of Jacob, the Naam, heavenly canopy, sweet of the stretched penis, psalmist of Israel. The patriotic epithet son of Jesse is really an attempt to Hebraize an original Sumerian Bushasa, erect penis, thus conforming to the other phallic names given the hero figure. The phrase has some particular interest since the form Briseus or Brucius. We may now recognize it among the titles of the phallic Dionysus and Bacchus. And in the description of David as the Na'im of the stretched penis of Israel, there is a clear connection with a passage in Isaiah about the Adonis plantations. You plant the plants of Na'iman, Adonis, you sow the penis of the field. The English versions usually render the word in the David oracle as songs, since the root ZMR means also sing. But this is just another instance of the idea that singing was primarily a sexual activity, whose function was to stimulate new life, demonstrably by causing an erection in the male organ. It is thus a cultic word, as singing, like lamentation, was part of the stimulatory worship of the fertility deity. It is in this cultic phallic sense that we find ZMR used again in Ezekiel's vision of the abdominal practices being carried on in Jerusalem during his absence. Having been shown the women bewailing Tammuz, Adonis, at the entrance of the north gate of the temple, he brought me into the inner court of the house of Yahweh, and behold, at the door of the temple of Yahweh, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of Yahweh, and their faces towards the east, worshipping the sun towards the east. Then he said to me, Have you seen this, O son of man? Lo, they stretch out the erect phallus before them. Put the branch to their nose. The bearing of the phallus was a marked feature of the Dionysic professionals, but, as we now know, it had more than a purely physiological significance. The penis was not only the sign of human generation, but within the mushroom cult it symbolized the sacred fungus itself, the phallus of God. The root ZMR, stretch out, is but a jumbled form of another root MSR or MZR of the same meaning, derived, as we may now appreciate, from a Sumerian word sur, stretch out, measure a boundary. Its use in wordplay in cultic mythology has probably caused more misunderstanding in later generations about the history of the Jews than almost any other. We happen to know that one of the names of the mushroom was the stretched gourd, for it has come down to us, transliterated in Greek from the old language of the North African Semites, as Kosi Mezar, and confused, as so often with names for the fungus, with the squirting cucumber. The root MSR, is also known in Semitic as the designation of the country of Egypt, the territory, or in the dual form as normally in Hebrew, the two territories, that is, Upper and Lower Egypt. So modern botanists have understood the old Semitic name Kosi Mezar as the Egyptian gourd, and what the moderns have done unwittingly, the old myth makers did intentionally. The sacred fungus was known as the Egyptian mushroom, and from that playful designation was born the myth of the Israelites' sojourn in that land. The New Testament also took up the theme and has the Holy Family flee to Egypt to escape the highly improbable persecution by Herod of all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. In cities as justification of the exercise, the text from Hosea. When Israel was a lad, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called him my son. Israel as the God's firstborn son in Egypt is the theme of the whole captivity and deliverance cycle of the Exodus. Thus Moses is commanded to approach Pharaoh with these words. Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your firstborn son. The carrying out of this threat to kill all the firstborn of the land of Egypt forms the setting for the institution of the Passover. And after the escape, Yahweh commands, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine. Earlier on in the book, we examined the philosophy of the fertility religions of the ancient world with regard to the special favor ascribed to the firstborn, connected as it is with the power of the first menstrual blood of the Virgin. Custom demanded that these specially endowed offspring should be returned to the god as a token towards restoring the balance of nature, disturbed by their birth and human appropriation. This is the cultic background of the Exodus Passover tradition, but the story itself hinges on the play between the name of the fungus as Mezar, erect, stretched, and Masar, Egypt, to set the place of the myth, and upon the common Semitic name of the mushroom, Pitra, and the root PTR, which gave firstborn, release, and unleavened bread. The Hebrew storyteller thus had in mushroom name and epithet the main ingredients of his Exodus story. The New Testament writers were not slow to see the possibilities of this Mezar epithet of the fungus for their myth-making. The root MSR, in its various forms, provides a rich harvest of puns for storytelling, and the New Testament abounds in instances. Perhaps the best known is the epithet given to Judas Iscariot, that has characterized him and those named after him throughout the civilized world, he who betrayed him. The verb MSR means hand over, as a betrayal, particularly to Gentiles. So Iscariot is the arch Masor, betrayer of all time. Another word or different root but similar in sound is misor, meaning bonds, imprisonment. Playing on this word and the Mezor of the fungus, together with the PTR root giving Peter, the apostle, and patira, unleavened bread, we have the story in Acts which begins. And when he, Herod, saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of the unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison. Pleasing the Jews stems from the Sumerian mushroom name, Mashtab bar Ri, read as that which is pleasing to the Hebrews, Jews, by a word play with Aramaic. The name Herod, meaning Haran, Latin Ardilio, Ardiola, serves throughout the New Testament as a useful play on the Semitic ardilla, mushroom, and does the feminine form Rhoda, who opened the door to Peter after his release from prison. Another form of restriction is the girdle or loincloth, and words for this in Semitic are similarly formed, as the Aramaic meshdra, taking the old Punic name Kosi Mezar, properly Kishalu Mesara, or the like. As the pattern, the mythmakers formed the play girdle clothing, that is, waistband or loincloth, and in the prophetic symbolism recorded of the seer Agabus, plays on both girdle and betrayal, handing over, are extracted from the mushroom name. A prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us he took Paul's girdle and bound his own feet and hands and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." The patronymic by which David is known in the oracle quoted above and elsewhere, son of Jesse, is, as we have seen, also Old Sumerian name for the erect phallus, Ba-usha. The same word, Ushsa, appears again in the name of one of Jacob's sons, Issachar. The story of his birth is a good example of wordplay based on a well-known name. But here the play is on a fanciful Hebrew derivation of the name and is obvious. Indeed, the writer spells it out for us in so many words. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben, another of Jacob's sons, went out and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel, Jacob's barren wife, said to Leah, "Give me, I pray thee, some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you should have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "He can sleep with you tonight for your son's mandrakes." And when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You have to have intercourse with me, because I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. And God favored Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, "God has given me my hire." So she called his name Issachar. The author of this little tale finds his theme in the fancied meaning of the name Issachar as Ish, man, and Sakar. He has hired, taking the name as if it were Hebrew. And in the cycle of birth and naming stories, Khan, tamed in that and the previous chapter, the writer has tried to find in each of the names of Jacob's children Soni, Hebrew root on which to make a punning reference to some aspect of his origin or character. Thus, Reuben is understood as if it contained the roots R, H, C, and in H, afflict. Yahweh has looked upon my affliction, Simeon, as if it contained the root SHM, here. Yahweh has heard that I am hated. Levi, as if it were of the root LWH, join. This time my husband will be joined to me. Judah, as if it were the root YDH, praise. I will praise Yahweh, and so on. Even if the names were Semitic, let alone Hebrew, some of the supposed derivations would be philologically impossible. Happily, myth makers were not academic pedants, or the world would be lacking some of its finest literature. Such stories do not necessarily indicate whether or not the people who composed them had lost the real meanings of the names of by that time. For wordplay among the ancients, as we have seen, was a legitimate means of religious exposition and source of cultic storytelling, and for the purposes of the plot and its moral, it was quite in order to spin out the old patriarchal names in this far-fetched way if the end product served the cause of pious homiletics. However, there are passages in some of the older oracles of the Old Testament where it is clear that the writers were aware of the meanings of the ancient names. For example, of Issachar, Deborah sings, "Why did you lie between the sheepfolds?" listening to the piping of the flocks. Much the same phrase occurs of Issachar in the ancient oracle of Jacob on his sons. Issachar is a ass lying between the sheepfolds, and he saw a resting place that it was good, and the land that it was sweet. And he put his shoulder to the burden, and it was for him a worker's labor. Now, in such oracular snatches, we have wordplay of a very different order from those tales just quoted. And because they are dealing with the real meanings of the tribal names, as distinct from the fanciful plays on supposed Semitic roots, we have hitherto been at a loss to understand many of the references and allusions. Now at last we shall be able to start breaking them down, but it will be no easy task, since they ceased to be understood from a comparatively early time. The chances are that many of the key words will have been changed during transmission. Happily, oral traditions are not so susceptible to change as those which are passed on by the written word. Children will remember a poem or a song by heart without necessarily understanding every word. We all have doubtlessly wondered in our youth why a green hill should need a city wall anyway. So, for centuries, the songs and oracles of the Old Testament will have come down exactly by word of mouth, even though their dialects had ceased to be used, or the words had been carried out of their original territories. Nevertheless, there will come a time when the poems will find written form, and the scribes will puzzle over forms and words quite strange to them. They will guess at their meanings, and here and there substitute more common words, or even add the colloquial explanation alongside the original. The modern researcher has to try and sort out the different literary strands, but if he himself has lost the key, in the case of the oldest Hebrew writings, the nature of the cult from which they came, there is little he can do but wait and hope that further archaeological and philological discoveries may shed new light on the points of difficulty. Unfortunately, when the writings become the central fount of authority for another religion, or a wayward development of the old, there is a temptation to make sense of the inherited scriptures at all points, and at any cost. In such cases, basic principles of grammar and syntax, and a free admittance of lexicographical ignorance, too, often give way before the need for pious exposition. To return to Issachar, crouching between the sheepfolds, Deborah's taunt rests upon a wordplay on the Sumerian mushroom name, Li Mash Bala Anta Tabari, read as, "Why are you resting?" Semitic SHBKH, be still, at peace. Why are you resting in the pasture? The next line of the Jacob blessing, and he saw a resting place and it was good, gives a more obvious play on the Adonis mushroom name, Na Iman, Semitic N-M, be sweet. The last phrase, it was for him a worker's labor, provides a good instance of a change made in the text at some stage when the original word became dialectically out of fashion. The text probably first read Mas Palak, and was intended as a play on Mash Balag, of the mushroom name. Both phrases meant the same, forced labor, and to judge from the number of times that this theme appears in the Old Testament myths, it served their authors as a favorite source of wordplay. The forced labor to which the Israelites were subject in their mythical sojourn in Egypt was in the way derived from the name of the sacred fungus. David's successor on the throne, Solomon, for all his much vaunted wisdom in offering to share a baby between its rival claimant mothers with a knife, showed less acumen in demanding forced labor from his subjects. Furthermore, the same phrase also had the implication of making a census of the people and thus administering a tax as well as a work levy system. Not unnaturally, this kind of administrative advance was not welcome. One account of David's eventful fall from grace was that he had designed such a census and was punished by his God for doing so. The Mashbalag, census, theme of mushroom mythology, gave the New Testament storyteller the dramatic means of bringing the pregnant Mary over 100 miles of some of the roughest terrain in the world from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be delivered of the Christ child. It is the ungrateful pedant, or overzealous religionist who bothers overmuch about the likelihood that any Roman governor would have been so stark, raving mad as to require everyone in his territory to do a kind of general post to the place of their tribal origin for the purpose of being counted. That particular author could, however, have saved subsequent less imaginative readers a great deal of worry and spilt ink if he had not seized upon a recollection of the name of one Syrian governor, Quinus, to add color to the tale. Unfortunately, Quinus did not become governor until AD 6, and King Herod, in whose time the birth of Jesus was supposed to have taken place, died a decade or so earlier. Still, even the best myth makers cannot have everything their own way. The point of Quirinus, Greek Quirinus, is that his name nude, an excellent word play with both Grunon and Gernanian, Greek names of the fungus. The mushroom allusions in the snatches of song about Issachar are not only verbal. The resting place, sheepfold, had a special significance in fungus imagery. It consisted basically of two barriers, set out like a funnel or an open V shape, through which the sheep could be driven into their fold. We have in this structure the stylized configuration of the mushroom cap, supported by the stem lying between the folds. In human physiological terms, Issachar, mighty penis, lies between the open legs of the woman, and seeing a resting place that it was good, and the land that it was sweet, puts his shoulder to the burden. To use another mushroom metaphor, Issachar stands ready to take up the yoke, or to bear his cross. The wordplay used to produce this resting place of animals from lamash, ba, la, anta, tab, ba, ri, served also the New Testament writers for their story about the stable at Bethlehem. And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. The authors spun out from the name of the sacred fungus. For him, a resting place in an animal's stall, as well as the more obvious play on pitch, orage, mushroom, and Peter, firstborn. At a more basic level of mushroom mythology was the image of the fungus as a manger, with the sheltering canopy held by the stalk above the cradle, or feeding trough, of the lower half of the vulva. Possibly Euripides, known of a similar tradition to the Christian story, when he has Pentheus order the unrecognized Dionysus to be carried off, and tied where the steeds are bound. Let him lie in a manger, and stare into the darkness. Adonis, then, was the prime fertility hero god of the ancient Semitic and classical worlds. We have seen how his names fit into the mushroom pattern, and it is also apparent that the Hebrew David figure is portrayed in the same phallic form. The oracle ascribed to him paints him in these terms without any doubt, and his supposed patronymic son of Jesse is but an attempt to reproduce in Hebrew form a Sumerian name of the phallus and probably the mushroom. The tribal name Issachar has a similar derivation, and again, in the oldest oracles referring to this character, its fungus nature is plainly evident. It appears that in the Old and the New Testaments, one of the Semitic names for the mushroom, extant, in a Punic version from North Africa, was misunderstood as suggesting an Egyptian origin for the fungus, and a resultant mythology brought Israel and the Holy Family from that country. The question must now be asked again, as indeed these studies must continually provoke the inquiry, how much, if any, of these biblical traditions is history? Despite the obvious allusions to an Adonis background for many of David's epithets, and the oracles and in the stories recounted about him, was there ever a real King David, whose court chronicles gave some historical framework at least for the tales? Was there, for that matter, any Exodus, any Moses, any Abraham? One difficulty in sorting out fact from fiction in folk tales is that the characters are often made so human that the listener finds it quite easy to imagine them as real people, even identify himself with them, where the same themes have been treated over centuries of storytelling. Successive narrators have embroidered the tales and made his characters more and more believable, until the point comes when even the most far-fetched adventurers and the most unlikely exploits, amatory, warlike, or muscular, do not deter us from wondering whether behind it all there was not a real Adonis, a real Hercules, a real David. Well, perhaps there was. What we are concerned with in this present work is not trying to sift fiction from reality, the man David from the stretched penis of Israel, but to find out what we can from the names of epithets and from the various mythologies of the ancient world. To what extent and in what ways the sacred mushroom was worshipped, and how far its cult was responsible for the later mystery religions of the Near East and Christianity in particular. It would not be surprising if real kings and heroes received names from their parents or their admirers traceable to titles of the mushroom, if they were adherents of the cult of the holy plant. Their historicity is not proved or disproved thereby. Nevertheless, if we all know of a character in our sparse records of the ancient world reflect only mushroom mythology, like Jacob and Esau, for instance, or Cain and Abel, then there seems little point in arguing that they were ever real people. If there was a real Jacob, good. But then it has to be admitted we know very little about him. A quite different situation obtains, however, with regards to the New Testament characters. Here, for reasons already stated, and which by now should be apparent to the reader, we are dealing with a cryptic document. This is a different kind of mythology, based not on pious aggrandizement by later admirers, as has been so often assumed in the past, but a deliberate attempt to mislead the reader. There is every reason why there should not have been a real Jesus of Nazareth, at least not one connected with the sect of Christians, nor a real John the Baptist, Peter, John, James, and so on. To have named them, located their homes and families, would have brought disaster upon their associates, and a cult which had earned the hatred of the authorities. End of chapter 16, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.